The sapphires were the first thing she noticed. Of course they were. They had belonged to her mother, and before that to her grandmother, and before that to 3 generations of Hargrove women who had worn them with the quiet dignity of people who understood that true elegance was never loud. They were exquisite stones, each one the color of a summer sky caught just before dusk, set in silver filigree that curved like the branches of a winter tree. Emmeline had last seen them locked in the small rosewood box her father had pressed into her hands the morning before he died, whispering that they were hers, that they had always been hers, that nothing in this world could take them from her. Her father had been wrong about that. Among many things, he had been catastrophically wrong about that. Isadora Beaumont stood at the center of the Thornfield ballroom in a gown of ivory silk, the Hargrove sapphires blazing at her throat and wrists and pinned through the elaborate architecture of her golden hair, and she was laughing. She was laughing the way people laugh when they have never once doubted their right to take up space in the world. The sound of it carried across 30 feet of polished marble and 200 chattering guests and landed somewhere in the center of Emmeline's chest like a stone dropped into still water. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Emmeline pressed herself further into the shadow of a marble column and breathed. She was very good at breathing through impossible things. She had practiced this particular skill for 3 years, ever since the morning Helena had summoned her into the library of Hargrove House and explained, with the serene composure of a woman who had already won, that the trust Emmeline's grandmother had established was, in fact, no longer applicable to Emmeline's circumstances, that certain documents had come to light, that the solicitor had reviewed everything with great care, that Emmeline should be very grateful Helena was allowing her to remain in the house at all, given that the house, technically, was now Helena's to dispose of as she saw fit. Emmeline had been 19 years old. She had not understood half of what Helena was saying, but she had understood the expression on Helena's face perfectly well, and she had understood it then for what it was now, the expression of a woman who had planned this for years and was finally watching the plan come to fruition. The dowry had been substantial. Her grandmother's trust, the Hargrove pearls and the sapphires, a property in Derbyshire that had once been her mother's retreat. All of it redirected, through means that Emmeline had spent 3 years trying to untangle and failing, to Isadora's name, Isadora's trousseau, Isadora's glittering future. And now here was the future, blazing in borrowed sapphires in the center of the Thornfield ballroom. Emmeline was here because Helena required her to be here. She had discovered this was another of Helena's particular cruelties, requiring Emmeline's presence at social events as a kind of living comparison, a shadow to make Isadora's light appear brighter by contrast. Emmeline would stand quietly in corners wearing the one good evening gown she owned, a dress of deep green silk that was 2 seasons old and had been altered twice, while Isadora sparkled in newly commissioned finery. She would be introduced to no one interesting, notice nothing, and serve as a convenient reminder of what happened to women who possessed no strategic value. She was 22 years old, and she had become very good at being overlooked. She had turned it into a kind of art form, the strategic deployment of stillness, the careful arrangement of her expression into something that communicated neither distress nor invitation, that suggested she was simply part of the architecture and not worth investigating. She stood behind columns. She found corners near windows. She memorized the layout of every house she entered so she could locate the nearest door if the pretending became too heavy to carry. Tonight, the pretending was heavier than usual, because tonight Isadora was wearing the sapphires, which meant that Helena had finally decided to use them. Emmeline had known it would come eventually. She had watched the rosewood box disappear from her room 18 months ago and had said nothing, because saying something would have accomplished nothing and would have cost her the fragile, practiced composure that was currently the only thing standing between her and complete dissolution. She turned her attention to the room in the way she always did at these events, cataloging it, measuring it, looking for whatever small mercy the evening might provide. The Thornfield ballroom was exceptional by any standard. High ceilings frescoed with pastoral scenes. Chandeliers that cascaded crystal light across walls hung with silk the color of champagne. The Thornfield family had held their estate for 4 centuries, and they wore this history the way old families always did, with total unconsciousness, as if beauty were simply the natural state of things and not something that had to be built and protected and sometimes taken. The guests numbered perhaps 200. Most of them were exactly what she expected at such an event: earls and their wives, younger sons in search of fortunes, daughters in search of titles, an assortment of politicians and clergy and military men of sufficient rank to warrant an invitation. She recognized faces here and there, people she had seen at other events where she had stood in other corners and watched the world proceed without her. And then she saw him. She did not immediately know who he was. That was, in retrospect, remarkable, because the moment he entered the ballroom, the quality of the room changed. It was subtle enough that most people probably didn't notice it consciously, but Emmeline, who had spent 3 years honing her ability to read the atmosphere of any gathering she was placed in, felt it instantly. A shift in the current of attention, heads turning, conversations pausing and resuming at a slightly altered register. The particular realignment that occurred when someone arrived who altered the balance of a room simply by existing in it. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of angular features that belonged in ancestral portraits and looked equally severe in person. He wore his evening clothes the way powerful men always wore them, with the complete indifference of someone who had never once considered that clothing might be used as armor, because he required no armor. His eyes moved across the room with the unhurried deliberation of a man accustomed to assessing things accurately and quickly, and they were dark enough that she couldn't determine their color from this distance, though she suspected. They were the kind of eyes that would be impossible to look away from if you were ever unfortunate enough to meet them directly. He was surrounded immediately. Of course he was. An older woman took his arm with proprietary ease. 2 men approached from his left with expressions of determined friendliness. A small cluster of young women near the refreshment table rearranged themselves in his general direction with the practiced subtlety of flowers turning toward light. "The Duke of Ravenmoor," murmured a voice beside her. Emmeline turned to find a young woman she didn't recognize, perhaps 17 or 18, with bright copper hair and an expression of mild exasperation directed at the scene unfolding across the room. She was slight and pale in the manner of someone recently recovered from illness, wearing a gown of soft rose that should have overwhelmed her coloring but somehow didn't. "I beg your pardon," Emmeline said. "The man everyone is swarming. The Duke of Ravenmoor." The girl nodded in his direction. "My cousin. He finds this sort of thing insufferable, which means he'll be civil for precisely 45 minutes before finding an excuse to retreat to the card room. And I'll spend the rest of the evening trying to explain to Aunt Margaret why he left again." She seemed to realize she had been speaking to a stranger and blinked. "I'm terribly sorry. I don't usually say all of that to people I've never met. I'm Araminta Cavendish." "Emmeline Hargrove." "Hargrove." Araminta repeated the name with a slight frown, the frown of someone searching a mental catalog. "Are you related to the late Earl?" "He was my father." The frown deepened briefly, then cleared, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like sympathy. Emmeline had learned to recognize and preempt that expression. She had found that nothing closed a conversation faster than acknowledging the sympathy directly, so she didn't. Instead, she said, "What brings the Duke of Ravenmoor to Thornfield this evening? I would not have thought this sort of gathering was within his usual sphere." "Marchioness Thornfield and his grandmother are old friends." Araminta lowered her voice. "And Aunt Margaret has been pressing him to consider Lady Isadora Beaumont as a potential match, which is why we're all here pretending to enjoy ourselves when in reality everyone is simply watching to see whether Caspian will show interest." The name landed in Emmeline's chest like a cold hand closing around her heart. Isadora, her stepsister, the girl currently wearing Emmeline's sapphires, the girl whose future had been built from the systematic dismantling of Emmeline's own. "I see," Emmeline said carefully, keeping her voice entirely level. "Do you know Lady Isadora? We live in the same house." Araminta's eyebrows rose. "Oh, are you friends?" Emmeline considered the question. She considered the sapphires at Isadora's throat. She considered the rosewood box that had once sat on her dressing table. She considered 3 years of careful, deliberate survival. "We are not friends," she said. Before Araminta could respond, a disturbance rippled through the crowd near the entrance to the ballroom. Emmeline looked up to find that the Duke of Ravenmoor had somehow extricated himself from his cluster of admirers and was now moving through the room. not toward the refreshment tables or the card room or any of the other destinations that would have suggested social purpose. He was simply moving, with that same unhurried deliberation she had noticed when he entered, as if the crowd rearranged itself to accommodate him rather than the other way around. His gaze swept across the room with systematic thoroughness, and then it stopped. It stopped on her. Emmeline had been looked at many times in her life. She had been looked at by Helena with cold calculation, and by Isadora with careless dismissal, and by the various society matrons who appeared at Helena's dinner table with expressions of polite pity. She had been looked at by men who found her unremarkable, and men who found her briefly interesting, and men who found her beneath their consideration the moment they learned about the circumstances of her family. She was accustomed to the particular experience of being assessed and found wanting. This was nothing like any of that. The Duke of Ravenmoor looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't fit, not with disdain, but with genuine, puzzled attention, as if she were a word in a sentence he was trying to understand, as if she were a question that had no obvious answer and he intended to find one. Emmeline held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds before she looked away. It felt like putting down something very heavy. She straightened her spine, directed her attention toward the opposite wall, and concentrated very hard on the fresco above the doorway, which depicted 3 goddesses in a garden with expressions of collective serenity that Emmeline found profoundly aspirational. "He's looking at you," Araminta said. "He's looking in this general direction. He's looking at you. Caspian doesn't look at people. He tolerates their proximity. This is different." Araminta sounded genuinely surprised. "How remarkable. You're imagining things." "I am not," Araminta said placidly, "imagining things. I have known my cousin for my entire life, and he has been to dozens of these events, and he has never once looked at anyone the way he just looked at you. So whatever you've done, please continue doing it." "I haven't done anything. I'm standing behind a column." "Yes, but you're doing it very distinctively." Emmeline opened her mouth to respond, and the words died somewhere between her lungs and her lips, because the Duke of Ravenmoor had crossed the room and was now standing before her. He was more formidable at close range. She had expected that. She had not expected the faint lines of something that might have been exhaustion around his eyes, or the particular quality of his attention, which was not the predatory focus she had braced for, but something closer to genuine curiosity. His eyes were dark gray, she could see now, not the cold gray of stone, but something warmer, the gray of deep water before a storm. "Araminta," he said, his voice quiet and precise. "You appear to have made a friend." "I always make friends," Araminta said without apology. "This is Miss Emmeline Hargrove. She's the late Earl of Hargrove's daughter." Something shifted in his expression at the name. A recognition, quickly suppressed. "Miss Hargrove." He inclined his head with perfect formality. "Caspian Aldridge. I believe this is the part where I pretend I don't know I'm supposed to be across the room paying attention to Lady Isadora Beaumont." Emmeline stared at him. "I beg your pardon. My grandmother has spent considerable energy arranging this evening. She'll want me to demonstrate visible interest in Lady Beaumont before the first dance. I'm told the sapphires she's wearing were selected specifically to catch my attention." Something moved behind his eyes, careful and controlled. "They're extraordinary stones. Do you know where she acquired them?" The question hit her like a wave of cold water. He knew. Something in the quality of his question, the precision of it, the way his gaze remained absolutely steady on her face as he asked it, told her that he already knew the answer, or at least suspected it, and was watching to see what she would do with the question. What she would do with the fact that the man her stepmother was trying to place before the most powerful duke in the room had just asked Emmeline about the provenance of jewels that had been stolen from her. She could see 2 paths ahead of her. She had always been very good at seeing paths. The first led to a careful non-answer, some graceful deflection that preserved the surface of the evening and kept her safely invisible. The second led somewhere she couldn't quite see the end of, somewhere darker and more uncertain, where truth was the only currency and consequences were unpredictable. "They belonged to my grandmother," Emmeline said, and heard her own voice as if from a great distance, very steady, very clear, resonating with the particular quality of someone who has stopped pretending. "And before her, to my mother, and before that to 3 generations of women whose family name is embroidered on the back of the velvet case they were kept in." She met his dark gray eyes without flinching. I do not know how my stepsister came to be wearing them this evening. That is a question you might consider putting to my stepmother, Lady Helena Hargrove, though I would suggest waiting until after the dancing. She'll be more forthcoming when she believes the evening has gone according to plan." The silence that followed her words lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. "That," said the Duke of Ravenmoor, very quietly, "is an extraordinary thing to say. It's an extraordinary situation." "Yes." He regarded her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable and was instead oddly steadying, like a hand pressed flat against her spine. "It is." He was quiet for another moment, and then something in his expression altered, became more deliberate, more decided. "Miss Hargrove, would you walk with me?" "I don't think that's a good idea." "Probably not." He offered his arm. "I find I don't particularly care." Araminta made a small sound beside her that might have been delight, quickly suppressed. Emmeline looked at his outstretched arm. She thought of Helena, somewhere in this room, watching. She thought of Isadora in the sapphires, laughing. She thought of the rosewood box. She thought of 3 years of standing behind columns and memorizing exits and practicing the art of not being noticed. She took his arm. He led her toward the far end of the ballroom, moving with the same unhurried authority she had observed when he entered, acknowledging greetings with brief nods, but not slowing. The crowd parted around them, and she felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes tracking their progress with the hungry attention of people who understand that what they are witnessing is a departure from the expected script. She did not look back toward Isadora. She did not look for Helena. She kept her eyes forward and her chin level and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, to be conspicuous. They reached the far end of the ballroom, where a series of tall windows overlooked a lit garden. He stopped before one of them and released her arm, turning to face her directly. "How long?" he asked. "How long?" she repeated. "How long has this been happening? The jewels, the dowry, whatever else your stepmother has done." Emmeline studied him for a long moment. She had been asked many things in her life, but she had rarely been asked something directly by someone who appeared genuinely interested in the answer for reasons that had nothing to do with social calculation. 3 years, she said. "Your father died 3 years ago." "Yes." "And in the period since then?" He was quiet, his gaze steady and considering. "Have you pursued legal recourse?" "I have consulted 2 solicitors. Both of them reviewed the documents Helena presented and concluded that everything was properly executed. Either they were right, or the documents were forged well enough to withstand scrutiny at that level." She paused. "I believe the latter." "You have no proof." "I have no proof that anyone with the appropriate resources has examined properly. I have the embroidery on the back of the velvet case. I have my grandmother's letters, which reference the sapphires by name and describe them as being held in trust specifically for me. I have the testimony of my father's personal valet, who was present at the reading of the will and remembers the terms clearly. None of these things have been sufficient, because Helena chose her solicitor carefully, and I could not afford one of my own who was willing to press the matter at the required level." She said all of this in the same, even tone she used for everything. The voice she had cultivated over 3 years of practice. The voice that did not crack or tremble, that communicated facts rather than feeling. The voice of someone who had put everything behind glass so that it could be looked at without destroying her. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Tell me something," he said finally. "Tonight, just now, when I asked you about the sapphires, you could have said nothing. You could have deflected. Why didn't you?" Emmeline thought about the 3 seconds she had held his gaze before looking away. She thought about the 200 guests and Helena's watchful eyes and the careful architecture of invisibility she had spent years constructing. She thought about her father's voice, saying that the stones were hers, that nothing in this world could take them from her. "Because I am very tired," she said, "of pretending the truth isn't true." Something in his expression shifted. She couldn't name what it was exactly, but it reminded her of the moment when winter finally begins to give way, when the ice doesn't melt but cracks, and the crack is enough to let something through. "Miss Hargrove," he said, and his voice was different now, quieter and more careful, with an edge she hadn't heard before. "I came to this evening because my grandmother arranged it, and I am not yet prepared for the argument that refusing would have provoked. I came because she wants me to consider your stepsister, and I have been considering her, and my conclusion is that she is beautiful and charming and exactly the sort of woman who is worn well on paper and is in every meaningful sense entirely wrong for me." He paused. "I did not come expecting to find you." Emmeline's pulse was doing something unsteady. She kept her voice absolutely level. "I'm not sure what that means." "Neither am I, precisely." He looked at her with that same deliberate attention, the kind that made her feel like a question being asked rather than an answer being delivered. "But I find that I'm interested in knowing." He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a card, which he held out to her without ceremony. "My family's solicitor in London. He's handled the Aldridge estates for 20 years. He's examined forgeries before and recognized them for what they were. If you'd like him to look at whatever documents your stepmother used, I can arrange the introduction." She stared at the card, small and cream-colored, with an address in Mayfair printed in precise letters. "Such a small thing. Such an enormous thing." "You don't know me," she said. "No. You have no reason to do this." "I have a reason." "What reason?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that whatever he was about to say was something he hadn't yet decided to say when he first spoke. "Because I know what it looks like," he said, "when someone is carrying something alone that they should never have been required to carry alone. And I know what it costs." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've been paying that cost for 4 years myself." She wanted to ask. She recognized that she shouldn't. Not here. Not yet. Not before she understood what she was standing in the middle of. She took the card. The paper was heavy between her fingers. "Real. There will be consequences," she said. "If your grandmother notices that you've spent the last 15 minutes speaking privately with me rather than demonstrating interest in Isadora." "I expect so. Lady Helena will also notice. She'll be furious." "Also expected. Your grandmother wants this match with Isadora. She'll press harder once she understands there's a complication." The corner of his mouth moved in a direction that was not quite a smile. "In my experience, Miss Hargrove, the things worth pursuing are rarely without complications." He offered his arm again. "Shall we return? I believe they're about to begin the first dance, and I think, all things considered, that I'd rather open it with you than with your stepsister." The words fell into the space between them with the specific weight of things that cannot be taken back. "That will cause a significant scene," Emmeline said. "Yes. Your grandmother will be appalled." "Almost certainly. And Helena will." She stopped. She thought about what Helena would do. She thought about the sapphires at Isadora's throat and the rosewood box, and 3 years of standing behind columns. She thought about this man, this strange and serious man who had crossed a crowded room to ask her about gemstones and listened to her answer with the attention of someone who intended to do something with what he heard. She thought about being tired of pretending the truth wasn't true. "She'll be furious," Emmeline said. "Then let her be furious." His dark gray eyes held hers, steady as deep water. "You've been managing her fury quietly for 3 years. I rather think she can manage being angry in public for one evening." Emmeline looked at his arm. She thought of all the careful, sensible reasons to decline. There were many of them, and she knew all of them, and they were all entirely correct. She placed her hand on his arm and walked back into the light. She felt the moment the room understood what it was seeing. The specific hush that falls when 200 people recalibrate their understanding of an evening. She felt Helena's attention like a hand pressing against her chest, felt Isadora's gaze find her and sharpen into something cold. She felt the Marchioness Thornfield stir somewhere to her left, and the Dowager Duchess of Ravenmoor, an elegant silver-haired figure near the fireplace, go very, very still. She felt the Duke of Ravenmoor's arm beneath her hand, solid and unhurried, and she straightened her spine and walked beside him into the center of the ballroom floor. The orchestra began. She had not danced in 3 years. Not since the season before her father died, when she had still been Emmeline Hargrove of Hargrove House, a young woman with a future and a dowry and a mother's sapphires waiting in a rosewood box on her dressing table. She had been a reasonable dancer then, careful and measured, never spectacular. Something about the way Caspian Aldridge led made careful and measured seem inadequate. He guided her through the opening measures with the confident ease of a man who had learned dancing early and never thought much about it since, which meant he gave all his attention to her rather than to the steps, and his attention was very full indeed. He watched her face with that steady, considering quality, as if he were still working out the answer to a question he'd been turning over since the moment he first saw her standing behind a column in someone else's sapphires. "You're counting," he said. "I haven't danced in some time." "Stop counting. Look at me." She looked at him. The room dissolved somewhat. Not entirely. She was too aware of Helena's presence at the edges for it to dissolve entirely, but it softened enough that she could breathe more naturally. His eyes were really quite remarkable at this distance. The gray of them was warmer than she had first thought, and she found that looking at them was less like confronting something and more like having found a fixed point by which to orient herself. "Better," he said. "You're very accustomed to being obeyed," she observed. "I'm a duke. It's an occupational hazard." The corner of his mouth moved again. "How are you feeling?" "Profoundly conspicuous." "That's rather the point." "I'm aware." She took a breath. "She's watching. Helena. She's been watching since we came back into the room." "I know. She'll make my life very uncomfortable." "She already is making your life very uncomfortable. The difference is that now you're making mine slightly complicated in return, which means you're no longer entirely alone in this." He turned her smoothly through a movement that brought them momentarily close, his voice dropping below the range of the surrounding music. "I want you to understand something, Miss Hargrove. I don't do things I don't mean. I don't ask solicitors to review documents for strangers as a social gesture. I don't dance opening dances with women I have no intention of seeing again." He met her eyes with an intensity that made her pulse do something entirely unreasonable. "Whatever this is, I mean it." Emmeline looked at him. She thought of her father's voice. She thought of the card in her glove. "You don't know me," she said again, quietly this time, less like a warning and more like an honest admission. "No," he agreed. "But I intend to." The dance carried them through the last of its measures. When it ended, when they separated with the proper formality of a bow and a curtsy, when the applause scattered around them and the watching crowd began to exhale, Emmeline was aware of two things simultaneously. The first was that Helena was moving through the crowd toward them with the focused energy of a woman who has watched her plan go wrong in a spectacular and public fashion. The second was that the Dowager Duchess of Ravenmoor, the silver-haired figure by the fireplace, was watching her grandson with an expression that Emmeline could not quite read from this distance. Not fury, not pleasure, something more complicated than either. Something that looked, from across 30 feet of polished ballroom floor, almost dangerously like reassessment. Emmeline breathed. She did not know what happened next. She had never been particularly good at predicting the future. She had spent the last 3 years simply surviving it, one day at a time, one careful breath at a time. But she knew this. The card in her glove was real. The solicitor in Mayfair was real. The man standing beside her, who had crossed a crowded room to ask her an impossible question and had listened to her impossible answer with the full weight of his attention, was real. And for the first time in 3 years, as Helena swept toward her and the Dowager Duchess stirred by the fireplace, and Isadora's laughter died somewhere behind her like a candle going out, Emmeline Hargrove felt something she had almost forgotten the shape of. She felt like she might not have to carry this alone any longer. She lifted her chin, squared her shoulders in the old green silk that was 2 seasons out of fashion, and turned to face whatever was coming. Helena moved through the crowd with the particular efficiency of a woman who had long ago learned to convert fury into something that looked, to the casual observer, precisely like gracious purpose. Her smile was immaculate. Her pace was unhurried. If you did not know her, you would not know that every step she took across the Thornfield ballroom floor was driven by a cold and concentrated rage that she had been refining for 20 years into something very nearly indistinguishable from composure. Emmeline knew her. She had studied Helena for 3 years the way you study weather, looking for the signs that preceded the worst of it. "My dear," Helena said, arriving before them with a warmth so precisely calibrated it could have been mistaken for genuine feeling. "I've been looking for you everywhere. Lady Thornfield wished to speak with you about the flower arrangement in the East Corridor. She believes you have a particular eye for such things." Helena's gaze moved to Caspian with a smile that contained oceans of calculation. "Your Grace, what an honor. I hope Emmeline hasn't been monopolizing your attention. She does sometimes forget herself in company." "She has not forgotten herself," Caspian said. His voice was entirely pleasant. "She has, however, told me several things I found extraordinarily interesting." "Lady Helena." He let the name rest in the air between them with the particular weight of a man who has filed information carefully and intends to use it. I was not aware until this evening that the late Earl's estate included the Hargrove sapphires. Remarkable stones. I believe I've seen them documented in the Ashgate catalogue of notable English jewels. The provenance is quite specific. Not a single muscle in Helena's face moved. The sapphires are a family piece, yes. Lady Isadora appears to be wearing them with great effect. Isadora has always done the Hargrove name justice. I'm certain she has. He glanced toward Emmeline with an expression she couldn't entirely read, and then back to Helena. I wonder, Lady Helena, whether you might be available to call upon my grandmother at Ravenmoor House tomorrow morning. She has some questions about the family she would like answered before she gives her opinion on the possible match. She is very thorough. He paused. She'll want Miss Hargrove to attend as well, naturally. As a member of the family, I'm certain you'd want to ensure the full picture is presented accurately. Helena's smile did not waver. It was an extraordinary performance. Of course, we would be delighted. Wonderful. Caspian inclined his head with perfect courtesy. 11 o'clock, if that suits. My grandmother prefers morning calls. He offered Emmeline his arm again, which she took before she could think better of it, and he guided her away with the same unhurried ease as before, leaving Helena standing in a circle of her own unspent fury, still smiling, still composed, still entirely dangerous. They had taken perhaps 10 steps when Emmeline said, very quietly, "What have you done?" "Bought us approximately 12 hours. Bought us." Before she can organize a counter-strategy, he steered her toward the edge of the room, where Araminta was waiting with an expression of barely suppressed delight. My grandmother will conduct the interview herself. She's done it before with women presented as potential matches, and she's very good at identifying what people are hiding. What Lady Helena is hiding, specifically, is something my grandmother's solicitor will find extremely interesting. She agreed too quickly, Emmeline said. She agreed because she believes she can manage the interview. She's very good at managing things. So is my grandmother. He stopped beside Araminta and looked at Emmeline directly. I want you to trust me for 12 hours. That's all I'm asking. Can you do that? She thought of all the people who had asked her to trust them over the course of her life and what that trust had cost her. She thought of her father, who had trusted Helena and left Emmeline entirely unprotected. She thought of the 2 solicitors who had reviewed the documents and concluded everything was proper. She thought of 3 years of being entirely alone in an understanding that nobody who could help her had wanted to share. She thought of the card in her glove. 12 hours, she said. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Ravenmoor House was everything Hargrove House had been before her father's death and Helena's careful dismantling of everything that had made it feel like home. It was perhaps larger, certainly grander, built in the manner of houses that have had centuries to become entirely confident in themselves. Stone the color of old honey in the morning light. Windows that went on and on. A portico that suggested not wealth precisely, but something older and more settled than wealth. The particular assurance of a family that had existed long enough to stop thinking about existence. Emmeline arrived in the Aldridge carriage at 5 minutes before 11, Helena and Isadora seated across from her, with matching expressions of controlled pleasantness that she had learned to read like a very short book with an unpleasant ending. Isadora wore the sapphires. Again, Emmeline did not look at them. The butler admitted them to a morning room that overlooked a garden still wearing the last of autumn's color, and they waited. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenmoor arrived at precisely 11 o'clock and brought the room to attention simply by entering it. She was perhaps 70, silver-haired and straight-backed in the manner of women who have spent their entire lives refusing to diminish. Her eyes were dark gray, the same gray as her grandson's, and they moved across the assembled visitors with the efficiency of someone who has been assessing people for decades and has refined the process to its essential elements. She looked at Isadora. She looked at Helena. She looked at Emmeline. She sat down. Lady Helena, she said. Lady Isadora. Miss Hargrove. A brief pause in which nothing happened, and yet somehow everything was communicated. I'll have tea. Miss Hargrove, would you pour? The request was so unexpected that for a moment Emmeline simply sat with it. Helena's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. Isadora blinked. The dowager watched all three of them with the patient attention of a woman who never wasted a moment and understood perfectly well what she was doing. Emmeline reached for the teapot. Her hands were entirely steady. She poured with the competence of someone who had spent 3 years serving as an unpaid companion in her own house. And she presented the cup to the dowager with the quiet grace of someone who had decided, somewhere between the ballroom floor and this morning room, that she would not be ashamed of anything she had been made to learn in Helena's household. The dowager accepted the cup and looked at her with those dark gray eyes that were her grandson's eyes, and said, "Tell me about your mother." Helena began to speak. The dowager held up one hand. "Miss Hargrove," she repeated. Helena's mouth closed. Emmeline thought of her mother, who had died when Emmeline was 9, who had worn the sapphires on Sundays and smelled of lavender, and had read to Emmeline every evening from books that were perhaps slightly beyond a 9-year-old's comprehension because she believed, firmly, that children were better served by being slightly ahead of themselves than comfortably behind. She told the dowager about her mother. She kept her voice steady and her hands in her lap, and she told the truth, which was that her mother had been a remarkable woman who had loved her family very much and had tried to ensure that love would persist beyond her own life in the form of a sapphire necklace and a rosewood box, and a trust fund and a property in Derbyshire that had been quietly transferred away from Emmeline's name without her knowledge or consent. She did not say that last part. She said all of it except that last part. The dowager listened with the full, undivided attention of someone who has learned that the most important information is usually contained not in what people say, but in what they don't. "Lady Helena," the dowager said when Emmeline finished, "you mentioned in your correspondence that Lady Isadora would be an ideal match for my grandson because of her family connections and the solidity of the Hargrove estate. Could you elaborate?" "The estate is entirely. I spoke with Lord Ashby yesterday evening. He knew the late Earl well. He was somewhat surprised to hear that the Hargrove estate was being described as solid, given what he understood of the terms of the will." The dowager's voice was perfectly mild. He mentioned the trust fund specifically. He remembered the late Earl discussing it. A sum of £20,000, held specifically for the elder daughter. She looked at Helena with the calm attention of someone who is in no particular hurry. "Lady Helena, could you clarify the current status of that trust?" The room became very quiet. Emmeline did not move. She did not look at Helena. She looked at the garden through the window and concentrated on the late roses that were still holding on, red against the gray of the October morning, with the particular tenacity of things that are not yet finished. "There were some adjustments made to the estate distribution after my husband's death," Helena said, "in keeping with his expressed wishes, which were communicated privately rather than his solicitor does not recall any such private communication." The dowager set down her teacup with a small, definitive sound. "I have asked him. He was quite certain that the trust was established specifically and unambiguously for Miss Hargrove, with no provisions for adjustment." The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own complete sentence. "I see," Helena said at last, in a voice that had lost several degrees of warmth. "I thought you might." The dowager rose, which ended the interview with the same decisive authority with which she had opened it. "Lady Helena, Lady Isadora, I am grateful for your time this morning. My grandson will be in touch about the matter of the possible match." She did not say what the decision regarding the match was. She did not need to. The shape of the morning had communicated it already. Helena stood with a grace that Emmeline could only admire, however bitterly, and curtsied and guided Isadora toward the door with a hand at her elbow that contained all the structural integrity of a woman keeping herself together through sheer force of will. At the threshold, she paused, and she looked at Emmeline, and her expression communicated with perfect clarity that the morning would not be forgotten, that whatever was happening would have consequences that Emmeline would feel in full, that this was very far from over. Then she was gone. Emmeline sat alone with the Dowager Duchess of Ravenmoor in a morning room overlooking an autumn garden. "I trust," the Dowager said, settling back into her chair with the ease of a woman who has no interest in performative discomfort, "that you understand you cannot go back to Hargrove House. I live at Hargrove House. You will not be living there comfortably after this morning, which amounts to the same thing." Emmeline thought about this. The Dowager was right, and they both knew it. Helena's cold fury was one thing when it operated in private, expressed through small cruelties and invisible restrictions. It was quite another when it had been publicly threatened, and it had been publicly threatened this morning, and Helena would not forgive that. She would not forgive Emmeline for being present. She would not forgive her for accepting the dowager's invitation. She would not forgive the late roses still holding on in the garden. "I don't have an alternative," Emmeline said. "You do." The dowager regarded her with those dark gray eyes. "My granddaughter-in-law's cousin, Araminta, has been in residence here since July, recovering from a chest illness. She is a great deal better now and beginning to find the convalescence tedious, which means she needs a companion. A real one, not a hired one. Someone she actually likes." She paused. "She appears to like you. This is not something that happens quickly or easily with Araminta." Emmeline stared at her. "You're offering me a position. I'm offering you a residence. There's a difference. You will be Araminta's companion in the same way that Araminta is your friend, which is to say informally and voluntarily, and with no hierarchy except the one you establish between yourselves." A slight pause. "My solicitor has already received the documents pertaining to your mother's estate. He will review them over the coming weeks. If they are forged, he will find it. And if they aren't, then we will find another avenue." The dowager's voice was entirely matter-of-fact. "Miss Hargrove, you have been managing an injustice alone for 3 years because you had no resources adequate to the task. You now have access to resources that are. I suggest you use them." Emmeline thought of 12 hours. She thought of trust. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this?" The dowager was quiet for a moment, and Emmeline had the sense that the question had landed somewhere more interesting than the dowager had anticipated. "Because my grandson looked at you across a ballroom full of more suitable women," the dowager said finally, and crossed the room. "And my grandson has not crossed a room for anyone in 4 years." She rose again, smoothing her skirts with the decisive efficiency of a woman moving on to the next item on her agenda. "Consider my offer, Miss Hargrove. You have until this afternoon." Emmeline considered it for approximately 12 seconds. "I accept," she said. She was shown to a room on the 2nd floor, east-facing, with windows that caught the morning light and walls hung with pale blue silk that had faded very slightly to the color of a winter sky just before snow. It was a beautiful room. It was nothing like the Rose Suite at Hargrove House, which had been hers before Helena arrived and had been quietly reassigned to Isadora's use in the first month after her father's death. This room felt different. It felt like a room that did not yet have a story attached to it. Araminta appeared at the door before Emmeline had finished looking around. She was already talking before she was fully through the door, which Emmeline was learning was characteristic. "I heard everything from the corridor," she announced, without any apparent embarrassment. "Well, not everything. Mostly the silences, which were very eloquent. Your stepmother left looking like she'd eaten something unpleasant. It was tremendously satisfying. She sat down in the window seat without being invited, which was also apparently characteristic. Are you all right?" Emmeline considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am a great many things at the moment," she said. "All right is somewhere in the list. That's honest. I find it's generally more useful than the alternative." Araminta looked at her with bright, interested eyes. "Caspian said you told him the truth about the sapphires last night, without any prompting. He seemed rather struck by that. He asked a direct question. People ask Caspian direct questions about things constantly, and he deflects them masterfully. He doesn't tend to appreciate when it goes the other direction." She paused. "He told grandmother about the solicitor this morning before you arrived. He'd already written to him last night." Emmeline turned from the window. "He wrote last night? He was up until 2 in the morning apparently. I heard him moving about." Araminta picked up a small decorative object from the window seat and turned it over in her hands. "He does that sometimes, when something is occupying him. He doesn't sleep well when his mind is engaged." She set the object down. "He hasn't had his mind engaged in some time. Not in this particular way." "The particular way." Emmeline filed the phrase carefully, alongside everything else she was filing about Caspian Aldridge. She saw him that evening for the first time since the ballroom, at dinner, where the dowager presided at the head of a table that was set for 4 and conducted conversation with the efficient warmth of a woman who believes that meals are occasions to learn things about the people sharing them. Caspian sat across from Emmeline. and he was as controlled and contained as he had been the night before, and she noticed again the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes that suggested the sleeplessness Araminta had described. He said little during the meal itself, but his attention was present in a different way than the other people in the room. He did not address her directly, not in front of his grandmother, who was clearly watching with the professional thoroughness she applied to everything. But twice she looked up from her plate and found him watching her with that same considering quality, that same sense of a question being turned over, and both times he held her gaze for a beat before returning to his food with perfect composure. After dinner, the dowager retired early with the decisive efficiency that characterized all her movements, and Araminta was summoned by the housekeeper regarding some domestic question that could apparently not wait until morning, which left Emmeline and Caspian alone in the drawing room with a fire that was doing its level best to fill the silence between them and not quite managing it. He poured her tea without being asked. She accepted it without commenting on the fact that he'd remembered how she took it from the brief moment at the Thornfield ball when a footman had brought refreshments and she'd added nothing to hers. "The solicitor will begin the review on Monday," he said. "Your grandmother told me. She also told you, I expect, several other things. She usually does." He looked at the fire. "She's been trying to manage me since my father died. She means well. She's simply not always right about what's required." "What did your father die of?" The question came out before she could consider whether she should ask it, which was becoming a recurring problem in his presence. He did things to her careful self-management that she found mildly alarming. He was quiet for a moment. "A riding accident 4 years ago. He was an excellent rider. One of the best I've ever known." He paused. "The horse shied at something in the lane. A rabbit, probably. He fell badly." The words were delivered with the flat precision of a man who has said them many times and still has not found a way to say them that reduces their weight. He was gone before anyone reached him. "I'm sorry," Emmeline said. She meant it with the specific, bone-level meaning of someone who has lost a father and knows the particular way that particular grief sits in the chest. "You lost your father 3 years ago," he said. "Not a question. He was ill for some time before he died. I watched it happen slowly." She looked at her tea. "There are people who say that is easier, that you have time to prepare. I have never found that to be true." "No," he agreed. "It isn't easier. It's just different." They sat with that for a moment, which was the kind of silence she had not experienced in a very long time. Not the silence of two people with nothing to say to each other, but the silence of two people who have found, unexpectedly, that they share an understanding that doesn't require words to demonstrate itself. "There was someone," he said abruptly, and then stopped. "She waited. After my father died. A woman I had been considering. We had not spoken formally, but the intention had been understood between us. I believed she understood." He set down his cup with the particular care of someone managing a response they don't entirely trust. She did not wait. It was, of course, entirely within her rights not to wait. I was in no condition that year to be what anyone needed. But I had believed. He stopped again. "I had believed that what existed between us was sufficient to survive the worst year of my life. It wasn't. It was not." He looked at her then, directly, with that full, undefended attention that she was beginning to understand was not his default mode, but something he was extending deliberately, at a cost she couldn't yet measure. "I became less trusting of my own judgment after that, less willing to believe that what I perceived in a situation was what was actually there." A pause. "Until last night." Emmeline's pulse did the thing it had been doing in his presence since the beginning, the unsteady thing she was trying very hard to manage sensibly. "You don't know me," she said, because it was still true and she was still not sure what to do with it. "You keep saying that. Because it's still true. It was also true last night, and it will be true tomorrow morning, and it will remain true for some time, and I find myself entirely unbothered by that fact." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know that you told the truth when you had no particular reason to, and when the safer course would have been silence. I know that you took a cup of tea with nothing in it, and were not self-conscious about it. I know that you poured for my grandmother this morning with steady hands, and did not apologize for knowing how." He looked at her with those dark gray eyes that she was finding increasingly impossible to look away from. "I know that you've been carrying an enormous weight for 3 years without anyone helping you carry it, and you've done so with a kind of dignity that most people in your position would have found impossible to maintain." He paused. I know enough. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere upstairs, Araminta could be heard concluding her conversation with the housekeeper in terms that suggested she was winning the argument. 4 years is a long time to be careful, Emmeline said quietly. Yes. What changed last night? He considered the question with the serious attention he gave everything, and when he answered, she had the sense that he was answering it for himself as much as for her. You were standing behind a column in someone else's sapphires, he said, with an expression that communicated absolutely clearly that you would not be broken by any of it. And I thought, he stopped. I thought that I had been being careful for 4 years, and it had kept me safe, and it had also kept me nothing else, and that perhaps the time for that particular kind of caution was finished. The words settled in the room with the specific weight of things that have been true for some time before being said. She could have deflected. She was very good at deflecting. She had been managing her own interior life at close range for 3 years, keeping it organized and contained and out of reach of anything that might disturb it. I think, she said carefully, that I am not certain how to do this. Do what? Whatever this is. She met his eyes. I have been very careful for 3 years as well. For different reasons. I've learned to trust very few things and very few people, and the ones I trusted before have generally. She stopped. I'm not saying that as a warning. I'm saying it as a fact, because you said you appreciate facts. I do. He looked at her with the patient, serious attention that she was coming to recognize as his version of warmth. I'm not asking you for anything except what I asked for last night. 12 hours at a time, if necessary. Emmeline looked at the fire. She thought of her grandmother's sapphires and a rosewood box and her father's voice saying that nothing in the world could take them from her. She thought of the solicitor who would begin his review on Monday. She thought of a room with blue silk walls and morning light. That I can manage, she said. The weeks that followed had their own particular rhythm, different from anything Emmeline had known before. Mornings with Araminta, who was restored to health in degrees, and expressed her restoration primarily through an increasingly ambitious schedule of social visits that she described as necessary for Emmeline's reintroduction to proper society, and that were primarily, Emmeline suspected, necessary for Araminta's own entertainment. Afternoons that varied, sometimes calls received at Ravenmoor House, sometimes the particular domestic piece of a household that ran with the quiet efficiency of a dowager who had been managing great estates since before most people in the room had been born. And evenings. Evenings had their own character, shaped by the particular gravitational pull of Caspian's presence, which she was daily becoming more aware of in ways that she was managing with decreasing success. He was not demonstrative. He was not a man who expressed things easily, and she understood this about him now as a constitutional quality rather than a deficiency, the same way that some people cannot carry a tune not because they don't hear music, but because the mechanism for expressing it is built differently in them. He showed things in other ways. He appeared in the library when she was there, with no particular pretext, and sat in the chair nearest the fire and read, which she had come to understand meant he wanted company without the pressure of sustaining conversation. He noticed when she was tired before she admitted it, and found reasons to divert whatever social obligation was pressing on her without making the diversion obvious. He asked her questions, quiet, considered questions, the kind that suggested he had been thinking about her answers before he asked, which meant he had been thinking about her. She was thinking about him considerably more than was sensible. She knew this. She kept it filed alongside other things that were true and that she had not yet decided what to do with. The solicitor's preliminary findings arrived on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of November. She was in the library when Caspian brought the letter to her himself rather than sending it through a servant, which told her something about the contents before she opened it. She read it twice. The second time more slowly, with the particular attention of someone making absolutely certain they have understood what they're reading before they respond to it. The letter was cautious in its language, because good solicitors are always cautious in their language, but its meaning was not caution. Its meaning was that 2 of the documents Helena had presented as governing the redistribution of the Hargrove estate bore signatures that were inconsistent with the late Earl's other documented signatures in ways that suggested the inconsistency was not the natural variation of a signature over time, but something else. Something more deliberate. The analysis was preliminary. Further examination was required. But the preliminary analysis was, in the solicitor's carefully chosen words, suggestive of irregularity. "This is enough to begin a formal challenge," Caspian said. "It's not proof. It's the beginning of proof. It's enough to compel a full investigation, which means the original documents go to an examiner, which means every irregularity they contain comes to light." He watched her face. Emmeline. He had begun using her name sometime in the second week, not as a dramatic gesture, but simply as the natural result of using it by accident once, and then discovering that it suited the conversation better than the alternative. She was trying very hard not to find it unreasonably significant. "I know what it means," she said. She folded the letter along its original creases with careful hands. "I know. She stopped. 3 years. 3 years of understanding that the documents had been forged and being unable to prove it. 3 years of being told that everything was properly executed and that she was mistaken and that she should be grateful for what remained. 3 years of standing behind columns and memorizing exits and carrying an enormous weight alone. "This is not the end," he said. "There will be more steps. It may take months. Helena has resources and she'll use them." His voice was level and serious and absolutely reliable in the way that she had discovered was his particular form of comfort, not warmth but steadiness, the kind you could actually lean against. "But you are not alone in this anymore." She looked up at him. He was standing beside the window with the November light behind him, and his expression was not careful in the way it usually was. It was open in a way that it was not always open, showing something that she recognized because she felt it herself and had been managing it with decreasing success for 3 weeks. "No," she said. "I'm not." He crossed the room to where she was sitting, and he stood before her, and he said, quietly, "May I?" And she understood what he was asking without requiring him to elaborate, which meant she held her breath for a moment and then said yes, and he took her hand. Not as a formal gesture, not as a declaration, simply as what it was, a connection between two people who had both been carrying things alone for too long and had found, unexpectedly, someone who understood the weight. She let her fingers close around his. They stood like that for a long moment in the winter library with the preliminary findings of a solicitor's report on the table between them and the fire doing its best against the November cold. It was not a dramatic moment. It did not declare itself or require witnesses. It was simply the specific and irreversible moment when two people stop being careful with each other and begin being something else. She became aware of the sound of footsteps in the corridor at the same moment he did. He released her hand with the natural ease of someone who had heard them a fraction of a second sooner and had oriented himself toward the door with that unhurried composure that was his natural register. Araminta appeared in the doorway, stopped, looked at them both with the sharp intelligence she generally deployed more subtly than she was deploying it now, and said, "A letter arrived. For Emmeline. From Hargrove House." The return of Helena's name into the room was like cold air through a gap in a window. Emmeline felt it in her spine before she was fully conscious of the shift. She took the letter. It was sealed with Helena's crest, which she knew as well as she knew anything in the world. She broke it and read it, and her hands remained entirely steady, which cost her something she wasn't going to calculate until she was alone. The letter was brief. It stated that Helena had been made aware of certain proceedings that Miss Emmeline Hargrove had seen fit to initiate against the Hargrove estate, that these proceedings were baseless and would be proven to be so, that Helena wished Emmeline to understand that whatever hospitality she was currently being extended at Ravenmoor House was founded on a misrepresentation of the facts, and that she had taken the liberty of writing to the Dowager Duchess to clarify the true circumstances of Emmeline's situation, that the Hargrove solicitor would be in contact with the Aldridge family's representatives shortly, and at the end, in Helena's careful hand, one final line, that Emmeline might like to consider what would happen to her brother's position at the Hargrove counting house, the position that provided the only income the boy had, if these proceedings were to continue. She had not known about her brother. She had not known that Tobias, 3 years younger than her father's other child by a first marriage, had found his way into Helena's household in some capacity. She had lost track of him in the years since her father's death, the way you lose track of things when you are simply trying to survive one day at a time. But Helena had known. Helena had watched and waited and stored the information in that precise and patient way she had, and she had produced it at exactly the moment when Emmeline had been starting to believe that perhaps the worst was behind her. She folded the letter. "What does it say?" Araminta asked. Emmeline looked at Caspian. He was watching her face, and she could see in his expression that he had already understood, from the quality of her stillness, that the letter contained something that had changed the shape of the morning. "It says," Emmeline said, with a steadiness that cost everything she had, "that I may have been wrong to believe this was going to be simple." She set the letter on the table beside the solicitor's report and looked at the fire and breathed with the careful precision of someone who has been practicing this particular skill for a very long time and has not yet found a reason to stop. The worst of it, she thought, was not the threat. She had learned to manage threats. The worst of it was that she had, for 3 weeks, allowed herself to stop expecting them. She looked at Caspian. "My brother," she said. "I need to find my brother." His expression told her that he had already understood, and that 12 hours at a time was still his answer, and that he intended to honor it regardless of what Helena produced next. "We'll find him," he said. She held on to that. She held on to it with both hands, the way you hold on to the only fixed point in a room that is tilting, and she breathed, and she waited to see what was coming. Tobias was found within 48 hours. Caspian's people were very good at finding things, and Emmeline was learning that the particular resources of a dukedom, when applied with genuine intent rather than performance, were considerable. Her brother was 20 years old and working in the Hargrove counting house under terms that were, upon examination, substantially less favorable than Helena had described to him at the time of his employment. He arrived at Ravenmoor House on a Thursday afternoon looking thin and weary and not entirely certain he was allowed to sit down, which broke something in Emmeline's chest that she spent the rest of the afternoon quietly reassembling. She sat with him for 2 hours. She told him everything. He listened with the wide-eyed attention of someone hearing the shape of a story they had lived inside without understanding its architecture, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I wondered. I always wondered. I thought perhaps I was wrong to wonder." "You were not wrong," she said. "What happens now?" "Now," she said, "we wait for the solicitor." The waiting lasted 3 more weeks. Helena's counteroffensive arrived in several forms. Letters to the Aldridge family solicitor asserting the legitimacy of the original documents. A carefully circulated rumor in certain drawing rooms that Emmeline was pursuing the Hargrove estate out of spite and wounded pride rather than genuine legal grievance. A visit from Helena's own solicitor, a man named Greer who had the self-satisfied composure of someone confident in the quality of his forgeries, who met with the Aldridge solicitor for 2 hours and emerged looking somewhat less self-satisfied. The dowager watched all of it with the patient attention of a general overseeing a campaign she has planned for and does not intend to lose. Caspian watched Emmeline. She was aware of this with the specific awareness she had for everything about him now, which was comprehensive and detailed and not entirely manageable. She was aware of the way he arrived in whatever room she was in without making a production of it. The way he asked her how she was sleeping, which she answered honestly because he had stopped accepting the alternative. The way he had begun, in the 4th week, to reach for her hand without asking, which meant the first time had not been an anomaly but a decision. She was aware that she loved him. She had become aware of this gradually, and then all at once, in the manner of things that have been true for some time before they are recognized. She had not said it. She was still managing the distance between knowing a thing and being willing to offer it to someone who could not give it back, the particular arithmetic of vulnerability that she had been calculating carefully since the night at the Thornfield ballroom. The solicitor's full report arrived on the 14th of December. It was not cautious in its language. Not this time. The examination had been thorough, and the findings were definitive. 2 documents bore forged signatures. A third contained alterations made after the original execution. The estate redistribution that had stripped Emmeline of her grandmother's trust, the sapphires, and the Derbyshire property had been conducted fraudulently and was subject to full reversal under law. Criminal proceedings were a possibility. Civil proceedings were a certainty. Helena, when formally notified, said nothing that was recorded, but she left London within the week. The sapphires were returned by Isadora on a gray December afternoon, brought to Ravenmoor House by a footman with no accompanying message. Emmeline opened the box herself, in the room with the blue silk walls and the morning light, and she held the stones in her hands and thought of her grandmother and her mother and 3 years of standing behind columns. And she cried, quietly and briefly, and then she put the box on her dressing table and went downstairs. Caspian was waiting in the entrance hall. He had known the box was coming. He watched her come down the stairs with those dark gray eyes that she had stopped trying to look away from and said nothing, which was his most eloquent register, and she crossed the hall and took his hand, and they stood like that for a moment in the December light coming through the high windows. "It's done," she said. "Not quite," he said. She looked at him. He was holding something. A folded document, official-looking, sealed. He held it out, and she took it with her free hand and read the first paragraph and stopped and read it again. It was a deed of gift. For Whitmore Grange, a property in Northumberland that she had never heard of, comprising 300 acres and a house that the documents described in language suggesting it was old and solidly built and not ostentatious. In her name. Specifically, unambiguously, irrevocably in her name. "What is this?" she said. "The Derbyshire property will be returned as part of the legal settlement." He watched her face. "That's yours by right and will be restored accordingly. This is different. This is not restoration. This is—" He stopped, and she saw in the brief interruption the particular quality of a man choosing words with great care because what he is saying is important and he wants to get it right. "This has been in the Aldridge family for 60 years. My grandmother inherited it from her own mother and gave it to my father, and my father left it to me. It is not entailed. It is simply ours. Simply something we have. Caspian, I am not giving it to you as compensation," he said, quietly and precisely. "I am not giving it to you as a replacement for what Helena took. I am giving it to you because I want you to have something that has nothing to do with what was stolen and nothing to do with what will be returned. Something that is simply yours, with no history of loss attached to it." He paused. A beginning rather than a restoration. She looked at the deed. She looked at him. She thought of her father's voice saying that nothing in the world could take her inheritance from her, and she thought that he had been wrong about the world but right, in some essential way, about the inheritance, because what she was holding now was evidence that the story did not end where Helena had tried to end it. "This is too much," she said, which was what she said whenever something felt overwhelming. "It is precisely enough," he said, which was what he said whenever she said that, and she had come to understand that this was its own kind of declaration. She looked at him for a long moment. "I love you," she said, simply and directly, without ceremony, because she was very tired of managing the distance between knowing a thing and saying it. Something moved across his face, something that was not his customary composure, but the thing underneath it, the thing she had been watching emerge in increments since the night of the Thornfield ball. He closed the space between them and he held her face in his hands, and he said, very quietly, "I know. And then, I love you. I have been trying to tell you that carefully enough that it would not frighten you away, and I have apparently been doing it too carefully." She laughed, which surprised them both, and he smiled, which was the rarest and most valuable thing she had seen in 4 months at Ravenmoor House. And he kissed her in the December light of the entrance hall with the deed of Whitmore Grange still in her hand. When they were married in the spring, the Hargrove sapphires were at her throat, and Tobias stood beside her, and the Dowager Duchess of Ravenmoor sat in the front pew looking not quite as severe as usual. Araminta cried happily and without apology. Emmeline wore the stones her grandmother had left her and her mother had worn and 3 generations of women before that had carried forward through time. She wore them not as something recovered, but as something that had always been hers, that had survived every attempt to take it from her, that had arrived here, at this morning, intact and blazing and entirely her own. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.